Hello and welcome to the Atlanta Vue.js Meetup. Yay, you're here. You have made it. It is great. We are super happy and glad to have you here. So a little bit of housekeeping first. We do have a code of conduct. We want to provide a safe space for everybody to be respectful of each other and talk about Vue and have a good time. So we're really focused on talking about Vue and being here to support each other and talk about Vue things. So with that being said, our next hello. Our next meetup is February 2021. And we are going to have a speaker who we haven't announced yet because maybe it is you. If you have a talk that you want to give, we would love to hear from you because we need speakers. So things you might want to talk about, problems that you've solved, features of Vue. Vue 3 came out. There may be new features that you want to talk about. This is an excellent place to do that. Useful packages in the greater Vue ecosystem, like Vue Utensils. So, you know, if you have a talk that you want to give, or if you have a topic that you want to talk about and tell other people about, we are here for you, and we are more than happy to have you as a speaker. I know that the call for papers for VueConf US, which is happening April 14th, 2021, online, they are still accepting papers until January 31st. So let's say that maybe you have a talk that you want to submit to that, but you haven't given it before. This would be an excellent place for you to give that talk at and get some feedback before you go up in front of a very large audience and give that talk. We are more than happy to be supporting you and giving you feedback on your talk. So please, if you are interested in attending or giving a talk or anything like that, do please let us know, and we will totally schedule you and make a meetup and make sure that you get a spot to talk in. I do have one other thing, and I have misplaced that window. Hold on a second. We do have a job opening that is a remote job opening that I have here. It is for a senior front-end developer for Vue. That is for a virtual game show video conferencing platform. If you are interested and or looking and you want more information about this, feel free to reach out to me or David Sander, and we will make sure that we get you that information and how to contact somebody about it. So with that, I am done, and I am going to pass this over. I'm going to stop share. There we go. I'm going to pass this over to Austin. So Austin, please take it away. Thank you. Yay.
Okay, let me get my screen set up. Okay, cool. So tonight I'm going to be walking through a talk called Building Better Forms, and we'll be looking at a bunch of different things. Before that, just a bit about myself. My name's Austin Gill. I am a senior full stack developer at a company in San Diego called Reveal Biosciences, although I've recently moved to Portland, which is awesome. And we do Vue, we do some Node on the back end. If you are interested in working with us, hit me up. I don't know if we have any positions open right now, but we probably will soon. You can also find information about me at austingill.com or twitter.com/stegosaurus. So a little bit of background into why I'm giving this talk. I wrote an article basically all of last year. I put out a different article every 2 months or so. And I built this series called How to Build HTML Forms Right. Across the 5 articles, we covered semantic accessibility, design, like CSS styling, user experience, and security, and it covered just around like 20,000 words. So that's on my website if you want to check it out. I also have a lot of background in Vue. I've created a library called Vutensils, which is basically what I'm calling naked components. So they have no styles at all, or at least the very, very, very minimum that you need for like a modal, for example, to pop up in the middle of the page. But it's focused on being accessible and lightweight, and you kind of bring your own styles. So this talk kind of joins those two concepts together a bit. On this topic, or in this talk, the topics we're going to cover is a lot of focus on what the platform already provides for us. And then we're going to look into how we can integrate some of those best practices and principles into a Vue application, and a little bit on just the glue that we need to bring ourselves to kind of stitch those things together. So getting into it, we'll get started with the very sort of base units of a form, which are the inputs. So the platform provides quite a lot for us with HTML inputs. It gives us some concept of state management. So I know that with Vue, it's really easy to reach for either state management on the component level or state management on the app level with something like Vuex. But in my opinion, we actually get a lot of our needs satisfied through the platform, just having an input that a user can type into, and then you can read and write to that input as you want directly in the DOM. There's also accessibility. You see, if you talk to a lot of accessibility experts out there, you'll hear a lot of the same gripes about how the web platform is kind of accessible by default, and we as developers do a fantastic job of breaking that accessibility. So getting an understanding about what the platform provides for us, not just with the native inputs, but also the native things like ARIA attributes and roles and things like that. We can go a long way with just using the platform. Styling, the platform also gives us some nice tools for styling, although there are some things that we kind of have to do ourselves more there. And then some validation in terms of HTML validation and some nice features in JavaScript. So let's move on. When you're building a form, you may want to build an input that looks more or less like this. I recommend using a div to wrap an input because, especially as you move more towards a component-based architecture, such as with Vue, it makes more sense to have one unit that you can wrap your markup with, because that makes it more reliable when you're using it inside of things like grids or flex layouts or things like that. And then moving on, we have other requirements for our inputs to be good semantic accessible markup. For example, every input needs a label. Every label should have a for attribute that that points to an ID of an input. So therefore, every input should have an ID. Every input should also have a name. This is important for user experience, as well as actually sending data. So we should be enforcing that. And then if you're going to have some sort of piece of content that describes that input, which in my case right here is just the word description, then you should have ARIA described by. However, this also may make more sense if your description is something like, if your input is in an invalid state, you may want to describe that that input is required or has a minimum length or something like that. As far as the styling that the platform gives us, there's quite a lot that we can get. Here's just a list of all of the different states that an input can be in that might make sense to have for having different styles. So the top left, you'll see that the default, we might want to have our inputs with a solid border. And then if it's focused, maybe we make that border color blue. If it's disabled, we might want to change the opacity. read-only, required versus optional, invalid versus valid. So there's a lot of things right here that we haven't even gotten into some of the Vue logic or changing classes or anything like that. It's just built into the platform available for us, which is, it's pretty nice. However, there are some caveats here that all of the things that we can access through these selectors can really only style the input or any sibling, any of the next siblings of that input, really, which can be a problem if we want to style something like the div that wraps around the input. And so we'll look at that a bit when we get into the actual Vue implementation. There's other things like the validation that the platform gives us, where again, we have things built in to HTML for creating some sort of logic that says whether an input is valid or invalid. In this case, we have the validation requirements that this field cannot be empty, and in fact, it has to have a minimum length of 2. There's a whole bunch of other validation, HTML validation attributes that you can get. I would recommend probably MDN as a resource, but this is just an example. And then as far as validation, we also have built into the browser the validity state API, which we can get from any input that you want to check whether it's valid or not. So you can access that by grabbing a reference to that DOM node. So in this case, we're adding an event listener to the input, and then on the input event, we're capturing the target and checking its validity. And the validity state API will give us an object that we can look at to see whether it's in general valid or whether it's valid for any of the different HTML attributes that we can assign. One thing that's kind of weird about the validity state API is the name of the properties on the object don't match the name of the HTML attribute, but there is one-to-one relationship. So too long would be if you have like a max length, for example. So there's a lot we can get from that. We can get pretty far with just that. In fact, if you wanted to, you could probably use this for a lot of validation scenarios where otherwise you would reach for a third-party library. And if you use this, you can save some of your bundle size. So now let's look at how we can take these things that the platform gives us and kind of use Vue to give it superpowers. That's kind of the approach that I like to take. Is I like to use what the platform has because it's intuitive, and once you learn it, it's going to last essentially forever. I don't know if the same can be said for Vue or any JavaScript library, and so I like to use it as a higher level abstraction over these built-in best practices. So what Vue.js gives us is we looked at some of the markup, and we've seen that some things are going to be required. Well, as a library author, for example, or as a component author, I can ensure that anyone that consumes my component is going to follow these best practices by using props in Vue. And props has features where you can make certain things required or have default values. We also have things like data binding, where we can track reactivity of some sort of value and bind different HTML attributes to other values based on the state of the component. And then we can use what Vue has for slots, which can just make this whole component or this whole like input API from a developer perspective much nicer and cleaner to work with. So let's look at what that looks like. And this is going to get a little bit weedy with some code, but hopefully it's not too much. We'll step through this line by line. So on the left side, we're looking at the object-based API, component API that Vue expects for a component. And on the right, we're looking at the corresponding markup for that same component. So we can see at the beginning, we have this inherit attribute set to false. This is something that's probably not so widely known unless you're a library author, but The reason we need this set is because by default, Vue does a lot for us under the hood, which is really, really nice. And it kind of gets out of the way. However, in this case, we have kind of a funny scenario where something that Vue does for us automatically is it will take whatever attributes we place on our component that we use in our template, and it will put those attributes onto the root element of the component markup. So in this case, when you're consuming the input, if you were to put something like an ARIA attribute on that component where you're consuming it, that attribute would be applied to the root element of the component, in this case, which is a div. So we don't necessarily want that, because as a user that's going to be consuming this component, they're expecting an input. And putting attributes that belong on an input on a div don't necessarily make sense. So this is a way that we can disable that default behavior that Vue does. Next, we can look at the props on the left-hand side. So again, Vue gives us the ability to define props, the prop types, to say that the label and the name are going to be strings, and the ID is going to be a string because that's what a label, name, and ID would be. And then the label and the name are also going to be required. Now, we as library authors can't determine what the label or the name for an input is going to be. Only the developer that's implementing this input knows that at the time. And so we say that that's required to make sure that every input has a label for accessibility reasons, and every input has a name for accessibility and data reasons, or semantic reasons. And then the ID, we can do something a little bit different. Now, we can default to whatever the ID is that the consumer developer provides, if they want to provide an ID as a prop, or we can do them a favor and either take that or just take some randomly generated string. And so with all that, what we can do is move on to a computed property, or a computed property, which is going to be an object. And what this computed property is going to do is take all of these things that we know are going to be required for this input, such as ARIA invalid will tell us whether the component is valid or the input is valid. We can bind to that validation state. We can bind to an ARIA described by. We can make sure that the ID is there, the name is there, and then we can spread in any of the other attributes that the consuming developer might provide, so that they can, define their own other attributes that would belong on an input that we don't necessarily want to define in our props. Over on the right, we can see that we have the same view, or the same markup that we saw above in the HTML, but expressed in Vue, where we are putting the label. We have an ID as a wrapper. We're putting the label with the ID. We have the label text in there. And then on the input, which is kind of the main point of this component, we're going to be using vbind and von to essentially spread in all of those attributes that are on the bind computed object. And we're going to basically apply all of those as attributes on this input. And then we can use the von $listeners, which is a built-in Vue feature, which will apply all of the listeners that are attached when this component is being consumed. It will attach all of those event handlers onto this input, because we probably expect that it's the input that is meant to receive those events, not the div. Okay. And then the last thing is we have the slot here at the bottom, which is, again, if a user wants to define some value inside of our component when they consume it, we can use this to just expect that that will be the description of this input. So that will make more sense in a moment when we see how this input is going to be consumed. Now, there's another part that we want to get into when we're talking about Vue, and that is if we're looking at this component from a library perspective, there's some other things that we may want to provide. For example, if you are an experienced Vue developer, you may have come across vModel. There's also some data binding that we can do for a UI UX sort of experience. We might want to expand on this input and say, well, it shouldn't just be an input. What if we want it to also be a text area? And then there's some events that we can provide for the user that's, or the developer that's consuming this input across validation. So looking at the same component, I've removed some of the things that we already covered, and here we're just adding a bit more to the component itself. But just to make it clear for brevity, all of the stuff that was there is now kind of removed, but just assume it's still there. So with the vModel, vModel is a convenience tool that Vue provides that allows us to essentially have two-way data binding for the reactivity as it relates to, in many cases, input. It could be actually any value that you want. But in our case, because we're dealing with an input, it will deal with the value of that input, and then it listens to, by default, it listens to the input event. So in our case, we are going to set up a custom vModel so that when a user consumes our input, vModel will still be available to them. But we have to define what property and event that model will be using, either consuming or listening to. So in our case, it's still going to listen, or it's still going to be watching the prop value, but instead of the input event, which is the default, we're going to listen to the update event. And that's because if we listen to the input event, then the user that's consuming our component won't be able to put their own custom input event handler. I hope that makes sense, but just a little key here that generally a good practice to create a custom event name for vModels. Next, we're going to have a prop, define a new prop called value, and this will just be a type of string. And that is so that we are matching the prop in the model. And then in our data, we're going to have a valid state, which will be tracking the validity of this input. And we'll have match as an event handler to the input of this, to the input event of this input element. And it can read that validity state, and it can update our local valid data. And then maybe we can emit just a new update to say that the value has changed. And that way that our vModel will be updated, and anytime that the input receives an event, or anytime that we fire the onInput event handler. And we also check some validity on whether this element is valid or not. Now over on the right, we can see that we've added a little bit more to our template. For example, putting a custom class that tracks the validity state of our input might be helpful as a wrapper on the higher level, because as we discussed before, it's not so easy to update the descendants of an invalid input with CSS alone, or with like classes. But if we can update the ancestor, then, so in this case, our wrapping div, then we can make styles to every element within that div based on the validity state. So we can give custom styles for the div itself, or for the label, or the text area, or the input, or the description. And that's because with CSS, we can follow the cascade and say that the styles for our invalid state might be different for each of these elements. Moving on, our label is pretty much the same, except here we have a little bit of a user experience upgrade for users that, or for our inputs when they are required, when they have the required attribute. When they have the required attribute, sometimes some people like to have a little bit of a different UI experience, to have maybe a little red asterisk. So we can add that if our input is required, we can add a little red asterisk. And of course, we can hide it from assistive technology with the ARIA hidden attribute. Because we don't necessarily want our label to read as label asterisk. Next, if we want to provide the option for developers that are consuming our I'm going to call it the V input component. If we want to provide a little bit of an option for developers using the V input component to be able to set it as a type text area and get all of the benefits of the V input in one component, but the ability to also apply those things to a text area, we can do that again with Vue. We can check the attributes that are provided. We don't necessarily need a prop. And we can pass the same input event and the same value where it goes. And finally, we have our input that's listening to the onInput event. We have our slots. Maybe inside of our slot, we have some validation messages. Maybe they're based on the validity state that we get from the platform. And now the last thing is the actual work that we need to do to fill in some of the gaps there is we do need a random string function. So I had a random string generator that was providing the ID. We need to provide the validation logic. In my case, it's something that's very, very simple. In your case, it might be more useful to check for different validity state properties, such as, you might want a different message if there's a minimum length or if it's supposed to be an email, right? So let's look at what our component looks like from a consumer's perspective. On the top, we have the input that we had before that passes all of the requirements for accessibility, semantic markup. We don't have styles in this example necessarily, but we know that to style this, we may need to use some custom JavaScript to change the class on the wrapping div. And in the example below, we have not only all of the benefits of semantic markup and accessibility all wrapped into one component, but we also know that it's going to yell at us if we try and do something wrong, such as forego the label or exclude the name. And we also have some nicer developer experience, such as being able to access vModel or being able to provide some custom validation or some custom styling based on the validity state. So the other benefit of having all of these best practices wrapped up into a single component is if your designs change or some logic changes, you can change all of that in one place rather than searching for all of the instances of these inputs that you have across your project that are made with HTML. You can essentially fix best practices or implement design changes in one place. This is something that I would probably recommend even if you're using a library, is to create your own wrapper component that wraps, if it, in this case, an input. If you're using a library that has an input that it provides, it's probably a good idea to create your own app-based wrapper around that component so that in the future, if you ever do change styles or libraries, it's just a matter of swapping those things out rather than doing a whole project level search and replace. Moving on, we have forms. So we've covered the inputs. Those are the building blocks for forms. And some people may think that with an input alone, you can do fine. You don't necessarily need a form because you can use Ajax to read an input and send the data of that input. But that's not necessarily true. So forms are kind of a requirement for in my opinion, for everything that's going to take user input in the way of a form, even if it looks like a single input field. For example, if you go to DuckDuckGo, you'll see that they only have one input. You might think that all you need is the input, and they might not even have a submit button. And actually, forms, using the form element around that input gives us a lot of things just on the platform. It gives us that validation check. So by default, if, for example, JavaScript fails, the HTML platform will prevent that form from being submitted if that input is in an invalid state. It gives us some level of state management, so we can check the state of the form from again, a validation level, but also we can target all of the inputs in a form using JavaScript. It gives us some UX features such as the implicit return, which if you've ever used an input, like a text input, and entered some content and hit enter, it submits the form. That happens because that input is inside of a form. So that's a nice user experience feature that I'd say, well, the users that are familiar with it and take advantage of it don't want to lose that feature. So it's important to use our forms to provide that. Next, it's actually the way to send data built into the HTML platform. So I think it's pretty cool and hip to use JavaScript these days to send AJAX requests, and you should absolutely take advantage of that as a progressive enhancement. But it's a good idea to keep your forms able to send data with GET and POST requests, because there are some cases where JavaScript fails to load or a user has JavaScript disabled. It's probably not very common, but if you can build your forms that way, then you'll know that even if JavaScript fails, this form can still be submitted. I think a good example of this is GitHub follows a good practice of making sure that everything is progressively enhanced. So if someone disables JavaScript, they can still submit pull requests or whatever. And lastly, we have accessibility features that users that are using assistive technology can navigate pages based on forms and get some helpful feedback if you're using a form input or input inside of forms. So the form markup is a lot simpler than the input. What you can see here is we have our method defined, we have some action defined, we have theoretically there would be a list of inputs inside of this form, and then you have a couple of buttons. You can have a submit button, you can have a reset button. The submit button will obviously submit the form. The reset button will return every input of that's inside of the form to the original state when the page loaded. It's a pretty important distinction because that's not to say that it will clear every input, because we can set an input's value by default with HTML. So it will reset it to whatever the original state was. So some things that the platform provides for us built in that we can do with JavaScript. For example, we can take a form. If we have access to the form as a DOM node, we can add an event listener to the submit event, and we can capture that form in the event target. Now, with the form, there is a DOM API called checkValidity, which will return a Boolean whether the form is in a valid or an invalid state, which is a pretty cool, lightweight, built-in way to say, hey, is the user trying to submit some data that's invalid? If so, we can bail out of the rest of the execution early. And if the form is valid, then we can continue on to the next logic. Another nice API that I absolutely love is form data, which I don't know if I would call it new now, but I feel like it does often get overlooked. Form data is an object that essentially you can pass it a form DOM node, and it creates a new object that can track all of the information for that form's data, or all of the inputs for the form. So if you had an input called name and you wrap the form inside of a form data, then you can map over, or you can loop over the different properties of that form, and you can see that there's a form with a property, or there's an input with a property name, and you can get the value out of it. Lastly, or moving on, we can see that we're using the fetch API to maybe make an AJAX request to submit this form with JavaScript so that we maybe don't have to make the user wait for a page refresh. So we'll read the action out of the form. That's the endpoint that or the URL that the form should be submitting this data. And we'll read the method from the form as well. And that will tell us whether the submission should be a GET or a POST request. Forms by default, or HTML forms, don't support any of the other HTTP headers, so or HTTP verbs, I guess. So post or put, patch, delete, those, for example, you wouldn't. They aren't proper for form methods. That doesn't mean you can't use them for AJAX requests, obviously. But then the last thing here is in the body. I'm passing that form data object to URL search params constructor, and that's because the one gotcha for form data is if you append it to the body of a fetch request, it will automatically change the HTTP headers to make it a multi-part form data request instead of the default URL encoded form data. The only reason that's relevant is because that may impact how the endpoints receive that data. So just a couple little side notes there, but if you have been doing web development for a long time, you may know that pulling all of the data out of a form used to be kind of hard because you'd have to loop over all of the inputs and get the name and get the data out of it. And then sending form data, you might be using something like Axios or something else. And really, the web platform today makes it very easy. Now, one last thing I want to point out here is because we're sending this form with JavaScript, we do have to prevent the default behavior of that form submission. And we should be careful to call the prevent default method at the end of this function execution, because if we call it at the beginning and somewhere along the lines this function fails, then we won't be submitting the form either through, or we can risk not submitting the form either through JavaScript or a regular standard HTTP request. So putting it at the end means that if this function fails, we can still fall back to the platform's native behavior of submitting the form with a GET or a POST. Now, let's take those best practices and apply them in the context of Vue. So once again, we can use props to enforce some best practices. We can use our data binding to make sure that, or to apply some security best practices. And we can use some custom events to make the developer experience a bit nicer in terms of the validity state and things like that. So once again, we'll have a Vue component with the options set on the left and the template on the right. And I should mention that if anyone has questions, wants me to go faster, slower, or I guess slower, if you have questions, feel free to shout them out or write them down, and we can go back. So again, we're going to look at the props, and we know that the action should be a required part of a form. That's because if we're following the principle of progressive enhancement, then in order to submit the form, we need to provide a URL where that form will submit to. I suppose if the form is submitting to the same page that it's currently on, we don't technically need the action to be required, but it may still be a good idea to provide that so that we are ensuring that in our template, the action is going to be defined. Once again, in data, we're going to track whether the form is valid or invalid. This is kind of an important distinction between inputs being valid or invalid, because when an input is invalid, you may just want to update the template or the styling around that input, but the validity of one input may not tell you about the validity of another input or of the whole entire form. So we want to track validity on the form because it doesn't necessarily know about the validity state of each individual input, but it knows about all of them together. And we can do something like prevent the form from submitting or preventing someone from clicking the submit button if the form is invalid. Or we can do some styling as well. Next, we'll have a method called validate, which basically just calls the validity state for that component and assigns it, essentially updates our little reactive property there. And then we can say that we can attach that validate method. Well, let me go back to let me finish the left side first. Is we also have an onSubmit method that takes the event target and then maybe checks the validity to let us know whether the user is trying to submit the form in an invalid state or a valid state. And then we can say that we can capture the data of that form in a new form data object. And then we can use Vue's event handlers to emit that form data. So this is thinking in a component library sense that we want this component to be reusable. So we don't necessarily want an individual form tied to the same some AJAX request. We may want to bring the logic of an AJAX request up to a parent component that's going to consume this form. So in that sense, when a user clicks a submit button, we may just want to know whether the form that's being submitted is invalid or valid. And if it is valid, then we probably want to capture the data from that form. Notice that we aren't using so far. We haven't used any state to track all of the different inputs in a form, such as if it was a sign up form. We're not using anything to track username, first name, last name, email, or anything like that. We can capture all of that data on the submission using just the form data API. So over on the right side in our template, again, we have our property for our action, which we know is going to be required, so we can bind it to the action. We can check whether the method is provided, and if not, we can fall back to a post method. This is a personal preference, and it also has some functional. It has some functional caveats in that the reason I like to fall back to a post method is for security reasons. By default, when you submit a form without JavaScript, you just submit a form on the web in HTML, it will default to the GET request. And what a GET request does when it's submitted is it will open up the action, open up the URL that's assigned to the action or the current URL, and it will append to that URL as query string parameters all of the data for the inputs. So if we have a user registration form that's going to send an email and a password, let's say, then that GET request will go to, let's say, a route we're calling /register, and it will append to that URL the query email assigned to the value of the input and password assigned to the value of the password. Now, this can be an issue for a couple of reasons. One is if a user is using a public computer, for example, that URL could be captured in the browser history, which means that another user later on might see the browser history and be able to read the email and the password and therefore be able to log in as our user. Now, that's not super secure. Same goes for credit cards or any sensitive information. The other security concern that we have with GET requests and passing query parameters in a URL is that those might end up in a server log, which might be accessible to other people of our team that don't necessarily have the access rights to be able to read username and passwords, but they can still kind of get around it by reading the server log, or other vulnerabilities like that. So defaulting to using the post method allows us to send data in the body of a request, which will not end up in the URL, which is a security concern for many things. There is a difference between GET requests and POST requests. In some cases, a GET request is a better user experience. So for example, with a GET request, you can bookmark the URL and maybe make that request again or share it or whatever. So it's not totally obsolete, but it should be an informed decision. And because we're falling back here to the method that is provided, we can certainly use the GET request on any form. I just prefer to default to POST. Okay, so moving on, we see that we're attaching a blur event handler to the form. This might be kind of strange to some of you because a form itself doesn't necessarily emit a blur event unless it has focus. However, attaching a blur event to a form it's a pattern called event delegation, I believe, where putting the event listener on a parent event will actually listen to those events or when the event is triggered on a child, that event will bubble up to the parent and you can capture it there. So by capturing the blur event here, we can trigger a validation update, which means that we'll be listening to all of the blur events on child elements. So any input, any text area, select any button or any link as well. Although it may not be a big deal if we do a validation check on those blur events. So if it is a big deal, we can always, in the validate method, we can check whether the event target is an input or text area or whatever. And then we have our submit event handler, which we listened to, which we walked through already. And then in the template, we also have our slot, where we are going to, actually, this is not a regular slot. This is a scoped slot. So Vue gives us this feature called scope slots, which allows us to not only use slots the way that we can basically capture the content of when this component is being used, capture the contents of that implementation, but we can actually pass information about the current instance of this component to that slot, so to those children of the form. In this case, we may want to pass information about the validity states, whether the form is valid or not. So from props, we looked a bit at some of the security that we can implement with props. We also looked at the scope slots a bit, and we'll see in a moment how those scope slots can really improve our developer experience and our user experience. So once again, we're looking back at the form. We've excluded the properties and methods and template that we've already covered, and we're going to be adding a few other features here. So for example, we may want to say that since we have a form and we know that we're going to propagate that form with some inputs, well, you could have a property that listens to an array of inputs or has an array of inputs, and maybe in the template loops over those inputs and uses our new v-input component to place it inside of the body of the form. You could also maybe have a Boolean property called honeypot that will add a little honeypot feature to our form, which will not be visible to humans or people using assistive technology, but might help us prevent spam from being submitted into the form by having a little hidden input that shouldn't be filled out. And we'll look at that in a minute. We still have the valid state here, but then we may want to add a new method called clear. So for example, as I mentioned before, forms can have a reset button, but there's no built-in way to have a clear button, which kind of resets all of the inputs or removes all of the value in all of the inputs. Again, the reset will, if an input has a value by default, a reset will reset it to that default value. But maybe we want to add a method that can clear our inputs. So we can do that on the form level. And then over on the right, we see a lot of the same markup, although we see that the input has been, the list of inputs has been added as a v-for loop. And we are including maybe the key, and maybe our inputs can also take some attributes. Maybe the array that we get as inputs will be an array of objects that have all of the required fields like name, label, maybe some of the other HTML attributes that we would want. So we can just pass that in with vbind again. This is a theoretical implementation. And then the honeypot feature might be an input that if it's set to true, then we add this other little input here at the bottom that again is going to be visually hidden, isn't going to be reachable by tab index, doesn't have autocomplete on, is already hidden. And the idea here is if this input ever gets a value, because it shouldn't get a value, if you're a human, you wouldn't see it, so you wouldn't be able to add a value. If this input ever does receive a value and the form is submitted with this input, this honeypot having some value, then we know that it was most likely filled out by a bot, and we can just forget the rest of the execution on the back end for submitting that data. And lastly, in our slot, we're still passing our validation status, but now we're also appending a method to be able to clear the form. Now the work that we need to do on our end to make this work all together is we may have to listen to some custom events. So we have some custom event handlers. We have a little bit of templating that we want to do for developer experience. So what that looks like is when we actually implement our form is we have our form. Actually, I included the method and the action here. We could exclude the method, so we have one fewer lines. And then we can use Vue's built-in submit.prevent to prevent the form from submitting, because in our case, maybe we want to submit the form with JavaScript. And instead of attaching an event to the submit, or instead of attaching a handler to the submit event, we can attach different handlers. One for when the user submits data that's invalid, we may have a method that alerts them for that. And the other one is when the user submits information that is valid, then we can have a method that submits that form maybe through Ajax or does whatever. So this is just an example implementation. I'll let you figure out how to actually handle those events. It's going to be different for everyone, obviously, but in this case, it makes the developer experience quite nice to not have to do any sort of validation logic and just know that when we get the valid submission, or when we get the valid event, we can just go ahead and submit that form and send it to whatever endpoint that we want or API. Next, we have some templating that we want to provide. So inside of the slot for this component, we can listen to we can attach our default scoped slot and grab the status of the form for the validity state, and we can have access to that clear method, which will clear any input that's inside of this form at the time that that button is clicked. So what's nice about this feature is, again, when we had our button before and all we could do was use it as a submit, we can actually disable that submit button if the form is invalid at any point. And instead of having a reset that may or may not work as we intend, we can actually use that button to entirely clear the form. The clear thing is not so common in my experience, but when you need it, it might be a nice developer feature to provide. That is all I have for this evening. We hopefully didn't go too long, but if you are interested in more information, then I have that whole series that goes much, much deeper into all of the native platform things at austingill.com. I think it's one of the recent blog posts. If you're interested in this sort of content, you thought I did a good job, I would appreciate if you follow me on Twitter. I post everything that I write there. Also, I have a newsletter if you want to get updates on that sort of information. And if you're interested in checking out Vutensils, the components that we looked at this evening are somewhat inspired by Vutensils, although we didn't go into as many features as are available in Vutensils because it would have just been a little bit overload. And then the last thing I want to say is I'm going to be putting everything and in those articles and doing a bit more of a deep dive. I'm going to be compiling all of this into a book. So if you're interested in supporting me, or if you're interested in reading this book, probably the best way to keep track of that is follow me on Twitter or check out the newsletter. That information will be coming soon. So that's it. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Alex.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That is fantastic. So I know I have some questions. I don't know if anybody else does, so I'm going to ask them now. With the listening to the Blur event on the form with Vue, does the bubbling effect actually happen? Because I feel like in my past experience, I haven't actually seen Vue allow bubbling of native events.
That is a good question. I don't have a definitive answer for you, but I think that I would be surprised if you couldn't do that. I think that Vue handles some things kind of weird because with native events, because some of their events are some of the things that they call events aren't actual events, they're synthetic events.
Right.
And I think that how you would attach event handlers like the onBlur event handler to those inputs it's definitely possible. It may not. Yeah, the answer is I haven't actually done that implementation myself, but you should be able to manage it by, at the very least, listening to the mounted hook, and then you could loop out, you could do a query for all of the inputs, or actually you should be able to do.
Yeah, if you do if you do an actual native, like unmounted, and then listen on the element.
Yeah, unmounted, you can attach the event to the form, and then it will list all of the inputs will emit the event, and it'll be bubbled up and captured by the form.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I had having done some stuff where I'm trying to make stuff bubble, it wasn't wanting to work if you're using the Vue one, so that's why I was asking. So thank you for that clarification on that. Also, I had never heard of the validity state API before, and now I am so excited because I'm going to be using that like crazy. I'm super pumped about that. I've never seen that before.
So that's the thing is I kind of got, before I started writing this whole article series on forms, I was discovering these things that the platform provides that I just got super stoked on, because sending form submissions with JavaScript used to be difficult when you had to rely on XML HTTP requests, and now we have fetch, which makes it easy. And so you don't even really need something like Axios, in my opinion, which means I can replace a library and have a smaller bundle. And then the same happened for state management. As I was using Vue's built-in reactivity to do this data binding, and eventually I realized, like, with form data, you don't really need that, because all I was doing was capturing the value of those inputs, and then on submission I would reread the state from whatever I was doing with Vue, and that information is available in the DOM in in form data, and in fact, it was less code, and so technically not really a whole lot. There wasn't a third-party library that I was going to remove, so I didn't get that benefit of clearing out my bundle size, but it did make for a more simpler and also built-in API to work with. Same with URL search params. It just makes like, if you need an object or whatever, you just like pass in the form data. I just love that combo. And then with the validation, like, yeah, I used to reach for a validation library almost all the time. And there are things that validity state doesn't do. You need to get pretty like you know, if you get very complex, you probably want to reach for a library, but it covers so much. And if you can build that into your forms in an intuitive way and in a predictable way, then it just gets you, you know, so much less that you need to reach out to these third-party things.
Cool. Anybody else have any questions, comments, thoughts? Go for it, Theo.
All right. Perfect timing, because like I said, new job, started learning Vue 4 months ago, working on my first real project, and it's all form. It's a form. The boss is like, yeah, we'll just have you start working on this form. No big deal. And I'm like, oh yeah, forms. Here's where I got a little bit lost. The validating specific inputs. That's what you're talking about with regard to the validity state API, is that right? But if I had like specific requirements for specific inputs, would I just be, how would I go about doing that? So beyond like this is required and beyond like, you know, I guess I can use the built-in HTML5 text, email, date, whatever, all of those. I would be using those through the, I guess, the validity, or that would be handled by the validity state API. I was ready to grab a form validation package like you mentioned. So maybe you can help clarify where I'm a little bit lost or just missing something, I feel like.
Yeah, so it's hard to answer that question without knowing what the requirements are for your validation. The things that are built in is you do have some types. So email is a good example. Is like, if I need this to be an email input, I can give it a type of email. If I need it to be a number input, I have a minimum or a maximum. You know, maybe I have a range that has to be between. Same with minimum and max length for a text. It can get pretty complicated. So let's say, for example, you have a...
I just want to stop you for a second. So actually, that's part of where I'm confused. If I had this particular field had a minimum and maximum size, how would I put that into what you just developed? Like, how would I pass it in as props?
So that's a good question. So the cool thing about this implementation is it leans heavily on what the platform provides. So if you have, if we're talking about the V input example, if you remember, part of what that input does is it builds an object with a bunch of HTML attributes for the ID, the name, the ARIA attributes. And then it also spreads in any other attribute that the developer that's consuming that input defines. So if you were to implement the input and then you attach the built-in HTML attributes for validation, it will add those HTML attributes onto the native input in the component. So when you use v input and you want to give it a type of email and you want to give it a min length of 5 or a max length of 256, all of those validation HTML attributes will be passed on to the input that ultimately lands in the DOM. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I got that part. I guess I'm missing the step just before that of like, if I'm using this and I have it looks like for V input, I'm using V input component for each input, right?
Mm-hmm.
So would I set it up so that I could pass in a min length and a max length as a prop?
So
Or
there's
that's
a difference here between prop and attribute, right?
or attribute. I'm sorry, attribute. Yeah.
Okay, then yes. So it would inherit the default behavior from HTML, which is the attributes such as min length, max length. If you needed to do that, if you needed to do that on, well, generally that sort of validation requirements are on an input by input basis.
Right, that's what I'm
my
talking
experience.
about. Yeah.
And so when you write the V input into your code, on that input you define the validation logic or attributes for that input.
Okay.
And then when you create the next input, you define the validation attributes for that input.
Okay.
And you can get you can go really far if you know regular expression, because one thing that HTML provides is a pattern attribute, which takes a regular expression.
Okay.
But then, of course, you have to write regular expression, which can be a major pain. And that's when you can reach for a third-party library that either does the validation logic for you, or maybe you can reach for a library or a tool that generates regular expressions for you. There's a couple different options there.
Okay. So if I decide,
I'm not against using validation libraries, but
any that you would suggest then?
Which one did I suggest? I usually, in a Vue project, I'll usually reach for Vue.js.
Okay, which I'm not sure that it works with Vue 3 yet.
Don't know.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, that's a lot of the ecosystem. We're still waiting for a lot of the ecosystem to catch up. So this may be a good interim option. Anybody else have any questions? That was an excellent question, by the way, Theo. That was fantastic. Anybody else?
Can I just follow up to that?
Yeah.
So what you had just said was actually interesting. You were like, okay, so as you mentioned, like there aren't a lot of packages that are not ready for Vue 3. And something that Austin, you had said was always build a component anyway. So if I were to build that component and then in that component use either write my own right now, but later on if I wanted to, I could actually put in a package, a validation package, right? So as long as I'm just using my own component, I just change it once and then it fixes it for all of them. Is that right? As long as the props are the same and whatever the inputs that are coming into the component passed in are the same, then that would work, right?
Yeah, that's the theory. I think in practice it doesn't always work out so smoothly, but generally speaking, yeah, that's the theory.
Okay, got it. Even just for styling, I guess it makes sense to have your own component. We just started using Tailwind, so like, okay, just create a component and for buttons and all kinds of things that you use all the time, and just style them once. So, all right, thank you.
Of course.
Cool. All right. Anyone else? Cool. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to stick around for a little bit to chit chat if anybody wants to chit chat. But yeah, thank you for coming and making a really fantastic meetup. Yay.
Thanks, Austin. That was awesome.